We made it to part 7 of the book, which is called On the High Wire, which is the last part of the book. There's only like 70 pages left. I'm really excited about it because this has taken me so much longer than I would have hoped for to get through this giant book with all the things that are wrong with it. I've missed most of the things that I want to talk about, believe it or not, even though I know this is many, many hours into it. However, this last 70 pages are maybe the most dense part of the book in terms of things that are wrong, because now he's talking about his Middle East policy. So the next thing Obama does is he starts running through his rendition of the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and also his interpretation of the current dynamics on the ground, which coincidentally are self-serving in that they justify his lack of, achieving a peace process, insofar as that's actually something that he sought after, which it wasn't. But I'll get to all that in a minute. First, I think I'll actually just run down in 5 minutes or so kind of a really brief synopsis of the actual history of Israel-Palestine, because I think a lot of people view it as just a kind of a clash of civilizations, just like two peoples in constant strife, and we just need to work it out in the middle, and have both sides realize that you can't have everything, and then just work it out, kind of like it's a marriage counselor thing, but just on the level of countries and civilizations. In reality, that's not at all what the dynamics are, and the actual specifics of how we got to the situation illustrate that. And so in terms of the history, essentially prior to World War I, Palestine was controlled by the Ottoman Empire, as was much of the Middle East. And the Ottomans did, despite being corrupt in other ways, allow for a degree of kind of cultural autonomy and self-determination or self-governments for the regions and peoples within that empire. And so the people living there had historic roots there going back centuries, if not millennia, like deep roots in the ground. Now in the late 19th century up through the early 20th century was kind of the inception of Zionism, which was initially a fringe movement, but a movement among Jewish people to have a homeland for the Jews, and that the impetus for that was that there was a lot of anti-Semitism around the world, and a lot of lynchings and mob violence and attacks against Jewish people, and so there became a movement to get a land for the Jews. And there was, I know they originally looked at like Argentina or some other places, but then they decided, okay, we want this place, and they called it Greater Israel, which included all of current Israel as well as parts of Egypt and I think Jordan and Syria, just kind of smack dab in the middle of the Middle East. And the guy who started that his name was Theodor Herzl, and there were others as well. And initially, it's kind of, and the way that they started was they would just get like donations from European aristocrats, and they would get support from people within the West that supported their plight, and they would kind of buy up pieces of land within Palestine from the residents there, and then they would form very small communities throughout. And I'd say that phase goes through the start of World War I, and that continued until the end of World War I. At the end of World War I, the Allied countries, the victors of the war, decided to take the losing countries, specifically the Ottoman Empire, and disband them and divide the conquered regions among themselves to create a bunch of colonies, which they would now dominate and control. And one of those countries that was created was Palestine, or rather colonies. But that decision to just draw a bunch of zigzags throughout the Middle East is one of the reasons that the Middle East is so dysfunctional today. Like the people that live along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border do not recognize the distinction between those two countries, and never have. And same with a lot of the rest of the region, because they were just artificially put there just 100 years ago, not that long ago, by colonial powers, and then the subsequent exploitation of those regions while inflaming tensions and propping up dictators and autocrats and anybody with the most ridiculous religious theology that you could imagine. As long as the oil keeps flowing, as Obama does in the case of Saudi Arabia, that didn't help either, but this was one of the root causes. So anyways, Palestine was created, and it was governed by the British, and during that time period, Zionism continued and accelerated, and the leaders of the movement got more and more support from Western imperialist or Western countries or the British. There was something called the Balfour Agreement, which a bunch of British lords supported the establishment of an eventual Jewish state in Palestine or in Greater Palestine, and the money kept coming in, and the settlers kept expanding. And remember, there are people living in these regions, and so clashes with them occurred more and more, and there was more violence, and there started to become some refugees, because again, like, you can't, one of the slogans for for the Zionism at the time was a land without a people for a people without a land. So they were the propaganda was, there are no people here, but there actually were people there. There was hundreds of thousands of people there, and you had to get rid of them if you were going to create a Jewish state. And so this was always the tension. And so, anyways, that continued up until 1948. Then World War II happened, the Holocaust happened, and that justifiably greatly increased public awareness around the issues of anti-Semitism and garnered the political support for an actual creation of a Jewish state. And so in 1947, the UN passed a resolution which created two new countries in what was former British Palestine. Like, Britain gave up their claim to the land. They partitioned it into two different countries, or what was supposed to be two different countries. One was going to be Israel, which was going to be in about 56% of the former Palestine, and the other was going to be a Palestinian state, which was going to be in about 44% of the former Palestine. And so just like overnight, what was a cluster of dots, the ever expanding, colonial areas, became a country in the majority of Palestine. The Arabs in the region did not accept the legitimacy of that ruling, because they said that we have the rights of self-determination. This is undemocratic. They went to war with Israel. Israel went to war with them. And also, a lot of the Zionists didn't accept this either, in terms of they wanted a Jewish state. And so about 40% of the residents of this new Israeli state, this new Jewish state, were Palestinian, were non-Jews, were Arabs, and that was a problem to them. That's what's called a demographic problem, and that's actually still a major problem for a one-state solution today. Israel would never allow for a one-state solution, because that would kind of flood the streets of Israel with non-Jews, which would be a demographic problem. And that was the case then too. They wanted a Jewish state, and so during this time, what was called the Nakba, or the catastrophe, happened, which is Israel, during this war, which went on until 1948, expelled about 700,000 Palestinians and caused them to be refugees, and just kicked them out of their land. And there was a lot of massacres, and maybe I'll put some of them on the screen right now. And if you look into the details of them, they're pretty horrific. They're pretty in line with other settler colonial countries. This is how you create countries of new people when there were people living there for hundreds of years. There's a lot of massacres to go around, and there's a lot of refugees and a lot of suffering and a lot of misery. And that was the case for Israel as well. And so just not overnight, but over the course of a year, in Israel's first year of existence, 700,000 refugees were created and kickoff of their land. And soon thereafterwards, another UN resolution was passed, UN 194, which said that the refugees have a right of return. And up until today, Israel still does not recognize the legitimacy of the right of return for refugees, which is absolutely something you're allowed to do. Like, if you're kicked off your country from settlers, just arbitrarily, you're allowed to return under international law. Israel has been denying that law for 70 years. They're going to acknowledge it at some point, I'm sure, once all the Palestinians are dead, and it's maybe 2030 or something like that. So then after that, there was, again, still a big trend of Israel wanting to become more Jewish, and so there was I think hundreds of thousands over the course of like the next 3 years of Jewish people that immigrated to Israel, understandably, after what just happened with the Holocaust, obviously. And so it became more Jewish. At the same time, the refugees were undermined. Israel continued to expand. It became more of a military power. 1967, Israel invades Jordan, Syria, and Egypt. And the reason they said they did this is because they thought that they were about to be destroyed. So they were doing it in self-defense, so they invade these other countries. And then surprise, surprise, they take over a bunch of land in the surrounding countries. And so the pretext, which was for the population, in order to convince them to go to war, that we're doing this in self-defense, we're about to be destroyed, this is an existential threat, we're surrounded by all these Arabs that want to go to war with us, so we have to attack them first. That's the same pretext that any country uses anytime they want to go to war. When U.S. wants to invade Iraq, we're doing it in self-defense. They have, they're going to have a nuclear bomb, war on terror, self-defense. We're bombing all these countries. Germany invades Poland, self-defense. Like anytime anybody invades anything, they have to do it in self-defense. Otherwise, you're the aggressor, and it looks like you're just doing it to colonize and increase your power. And people don't like that. They like to think of themselves as the good guys, as reading Obama's book makes very, very clear. And so it's called the 6-Day War. Israel cleans house and destroys like the armies of all those countries. They take over the Sinai in Egypt, which is like bigger than all of Israel. They take over the Gaza and do they take over? They take over the West Bank. They take over the Golan Heights, and Israel expands significantly. This is when you hear about the Palestinian problem. When you hear about the occupation, this is the occupation. Gaza and the West Bank, primarily the West Bank, is occupied territory, which was formerly in Jordan. So Israel, for right or wrong, for better or worse, Israel is acknowledged, like Israel, the state of Israel, as a legitimate state, given that the UN partitioned it. Now, the occupied territories were just invaded by, in 1967, and, just has Israel soldiers there, and Israel controls it just by power, has never been recognized. That's why it's occupied territories. It's illegal under international law. So if you're going to have an international system, there's a bitter pill to swallow that pretty much all countries' foundings start with colonialism, and there's people that are displaced, and that just sucks in the terms of how the world works. But there is still laws that say you're not allowed to just invade other countries and gobble them up unless the international community recognizes it. And so land that's one of the good things about the UN is that land that's acquired via conquest is not legitimate. And so that's the occupied territories. Now, it's been 50 years at this point, 53 years, and the territories are still occupied, and they're growing ever smaller, as I'm about to talk about. But that's the primary problem. And Israel has held those territories the whole time. And so that's why it's known as the occupied territories. After that, there was another war with Egypt, where they had to give back the Sinai, and they signed the Camp David Accords with Carter. And Israel kept invading other countries, like they invaded Lebanon. I think they've invaded Lebanon 4 or 5 times in the last 40 years, that it keeps happening. But Egypt became an ally, and they became more friendly with Jordan and Syria and the neighboring countries. And also, the U.S. started really pumping up Israel with a bunch of defense spending, or a bunch of military aid, because the U.S. again wants to control the whole region. We have bases all over the place, and Israel at that time had proven itself as a strong military that could be relied upon to take action in the region in order to maintain the global order. And then there was also kind of cultural tie. There's big pressure from kind of the Christian right and from fundamentalists to protect Israel for other reasons, which are big contradictions, because one of the main reasons they want it there is so that when the rapture happens, which is just around the corner, then all of the people in, most of the Jews are going to go to hell, but it's better for the Jews to be there to make sure that the Christians go up once Jesus comes back and kills everybody after the flying iron locusts with their, bronze armor and their stingers torture people after. I would recommend reading the book of Revelations if you haven't. It was a surprise. But anyways, those people think that Israel is going to be the place where the rapture happens, so they have to make sure that Muslims aren't there, but instead Jewish people are there. So since then, since 1967, there's been an international consensus that is developed, which says that, okay, this two-state solution, which we've been in favor of nominally since 1947, but obviously didn't happen right after the war, we support a two-state solution roughly around the June 1967 borders, meaning that Israel has no right to the occupied territory, and that's where the Palestinian, state should be, in the West Bank and then also Gaza, which is like roughly a third of the former Palestine is where the Palestinian state would be, which shows us already how much they've given up. Since then, the whole entire world has got on board. Like, there's UN resolutions pretty much every year calling for the end of the occupation and a two-state solution roughly around those borders, which are internationally recognized, which the U.S. blocks every single time. The U.S. blocks in the Security Council, and the U.S. and Israel and maybe like a couple random island nations in the Caribbean will vote against, and 100 and something countries, all of South America, all of Africa, all of Europe, all of Asia, everybody votes in support of, but the U.S. is blocking. And the reason that Israel is blocking it is really simple. It's that they don't want a two-state solution. What they want is what's happening, which is a continued stalemate where the facade of a peace process, an ongoing peace process, is maintained, while at the same time they gobble up larger and larger portions of the West Bank and build settlements there and build over Palestinians there and take over the water resources there, which are strategically important, and tell the Palestinians live in smaller and smaller banter-stands in the West Bank, and Gaza's totally decrepit and destroyed. And, so they can keep their little, scraps of land here. We'll get all the important stuff, and during the whole time, we'll placate the international community and the U.S. population and people who actually think that they're working towards a peace process with a peace process, when in reality it's just a way to. It's like, okay, here's the situation. Like, this is an oversimplification, but this is fundamentally the situation. It's like, okay, there's two people. They're arguing over how much of a pizza that they should each be able to get, and they're like negotiating about it. Like, okay, I'm bigger, I should get 2/3 of it, you're a third of, you weigh less than me. Like, oh, I think we should split it 50-50. And so they're negotiating like this would be the negotiation process. And one person the whole time while the negotiations are happening is eating the pizza, slice after slice after slice. This is what Israel is doing, and that's the principal reason that it's like they don't want, like, as long as, like, oh yeah, no, let's keep negotiating as I eat the entire pizza and leave you with crumbs at the end. And at the end, like, pretty soon it's going to be like the prospect for a two-state solution is going to be totally off the table, because the land is gone. The land is gone. And the settlements have been built. And this is what Israel wants. And that's why when Netanyahu said a couple of months ago that he supports annexation, this is what this has all been building up to this whole time. And I won't go into too much of the details with the peace process, but it's nominally been negotiations with the PLO, which is just the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which was previously a terrorist organization. Insofar as terrorism is defined as people who are getting their land taken from them by an occupying power illegitimately are resisting, that's terrorism. And then they also targeted civilians, which is terror. But it's like, okay, we know what would happen, like, if the U.S. got invaded, and then the people that were taking over the land of the Americans, started calling them terrorists for, fighting back and defending their land as it gets gobbled up illegitimately. Like, okay, that's what, and Israel will call everybody terrorist. Hamas is terrorist, Hezbollah is terrorist, Arafat is a terrorist, the PLO is terrorist. And there's different ambiguities, and some of these organizations are not good at all, and they're fundamentalist as well. But that was the thing. But anyways, the peace process originally started in Oslo in 1994, where the PLO, which had been defined as like a terrorist organization, then was co-opted by Israel because PLO was running out of fund. I shouldn't go into detail too much about this, but pretty much the PLO was running out of funding because they didn't support like Saddam Hussein, or they supported him during his invasion of Kuwait, and so the Arab countries which were funding the PLO, their funding dried out, and so Arafat ran cap in hand to Israel, which started funding him with the prerequisite that the facade of a peace process was going to commence with this puppet of Israel named Yasser Arafat and the PLO negotiating with Israel for this, and that's been going on for 25 years at this point. Nothing has happened, and Israel is gobbling up more and more of the West Bank. And so that's essentially the problem with Israel. And during that whole time, every few years, Israel decides to bomb Gaza, and it's also become more right wing and authoritarian, and kind of racist as well against Palestinians, and it's not a good trend. All right, so that took a little longer than I'd hoped for, but hopefully going through that history might have been helpful for a few individuals, maybe. Otherwise, it's just a total waste of time, and I'm just sitting in the forest by myself. And so now that we've built the foundation, maybe we can evaluate some of the higher level claims that Obama makes about his role in the peace process, as well as his rendition of the history here. So the first thing I want to talk about, which he talks about, is he says that practically every U.S. president since Truman, then had tried to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict with varying degrees of success. The historic Camp David Accords, brokered in 1978 by Jimmy Carter, achieved a long-lasting peace between Israel and Egypt and returned the Sinai to Egyptian control. Again, that's true. That specific thing is true, as in there was a Camp David's, and Jimmy Carter did win the Peace Prize for it. On the other, and it is also true that there are small fluctuations within U.S. policies with different administrations, but that's really fundamentally misleading, because the more important thing to remember is that those fluctuations are only allowed to be permitted within a certain boundary of universally held assumptions by pretty much every U.S. policymaker and president and administration. And that's really what dictates policy. And so those assumptions, like the number one thing is that the U.S., we need to look after our interests. And so our interests are to maintaining the world order, and specifically having the Middle East be kind of the energy well for the rest of the world, and so we need to have the hand on the spigot there and control the energy resources in the region, which need to be, the wealth of that region shouldn't be going back to secular nationalists that want to redistribute it to the population of those regions and those countries, but rather to U.S. corporations and to people tied to Western interests, so that we continue to control the supply. So within that framework, if a president like Carter, who was probably my favorite president in the last 50 years, not that I was alive for it, but if he wants to decide to work to make the region more stable in the long term, which is what as I mentioned, what the Camp David Accord, having Egypt, having the Sinai returned to Egypt by Israel in return for kind of an armistice and an agreement between the two countries, so that that tensions were reduced, which was a good thing in this case for U.S. interests, in that Egypt became incorporated into the Western orbit when previously it had been one of the non-aligned countries, or even had slight influence from the Soviets. And so that was a good thing for the U.S., but there was a pill to swallow for Israel, which was to give back the Sinai, which they had just taken over illegally, a few years prior, or 10 years prior. And so in that sense, it was a good thing that happened, but it was within the larger framework of U.S. interests. Now, that being said, that's really was the best thing that was done for the peace agreement since, in the last 50 years was that return. Since then, no major, there has been no major, the West Bank has just been gobbled up more and more. Gaza has been destroyed more and more. And tensions have increased more and more, and right-wing authoritarianism has risen more within Israel, and the situation hasn't fundamentally changed. And so even this type of piecemeal reform was kind of unique to the Carter administration, but hasn't been pursued since. All right, so this paragraph, Obama actually talks correctly about the conflict, in my opinion. He says that most importantly, he's talking about why the peace process has broken down, and he's leaving out a lot of stuff, but he says most importantly, Israeli attitudes toward peace talks had hardened, in part because peace no longer seemed so crucial to ensuring this country's safety and prosperity. The Israel of the 1960s that remained lodged in the public imagination with its communal kibbutz living and periodic rationing of basic supplies had been transformed into a modern economic powerhouse. It was no longer the plucky David surrounded by hostile Goliath. Thanks to tens of billions of dollars in U.S. military aid, the Israeli armed forces were now matchless in the regions. Terrorist bombings and attacks within Israel all but ceased, due in some measure to the fact that Israel had erected a wall more than 400 miles long between itself and Palestinian population centers in the West Bank. punctuated strategically by checkpoints to control the flow of Palestinian workers in and out of Israel. Every so often, rocket fire from Gaza still endangered the lives of those living in Israeli border towns. That rocket fire happens almost exclusively when Israel decides to bomb Gaza and invade and occupy Gaza. The blockade itself is an occupation, and so Israel controls everything going in and out of Gaza constantly. It's like the world's largest open air prison. People aren't allowed to go in and out. The water there is poison. It is like they don't have electricity for most of the day. I think they eat about 1,400 calories a day. It's one of the densest populations in the world. I forgot if I've said this already. It's one of the youngest populations in the world. It's like 51% children, and it's hopeless. According to the UN, unlivable by 2020. It's 2021 now, but what he's saying here is true in terms of like the urgency for peace has subsided since the 60s or since whenever, since Israel grew as a military power and was able to control what was happening in Israel proper, so that the Israelis don't see like the threat of terrorism isn't really there. There's just a couple rockets that will be exploded by the Iron Dome, and like I think like in during the last invasion of Gaza in 2014, I think like one Israeli child was killed compared to like on the order of 1,000, Palestinians. And of course, the one that's killed by rocket fire is just talked about over and over again and propagandized to make the Israelis think that they're under siege and the like. But in reality, it's a very secure place, and they have overwhelming power to control things. And so when it's a silent suffering of millions of people in a densely packed area, starving, living in poverty, unable to leave, unable to get food, unable to get clean water and basic human rights, that's okay. It's out of sight, out of mind, which I think as an American, people might be able to understand. Like we know what's going on in Africa. We know, the what's happening with the people making our shoes and stuff in sweatshops in Southeast Asia. We know there's lots of bad things. We know what it looks like to, eat McDonald's hamburgers, like how they come about it. But we don't like watching the PETA videos. We don't like thinking too much about what's happening in the sweatshops. We don't like thinking about, how our shiny jewelry comes from, child labor in wherever in the Congo, or like this is stuff everybody knows it, but because it's not right in front of us, people don't really want to act on it. And it's the same thing with Israel, and Obama's more or less acknowledged it, that since it became secure, the urgency for peace really wasn't there. And the other motivations, in my view, came to the forefront, which were always the motivations, which were expansion. And so regardless of the era, Israel continues to expand, especially since 1967. But what he doesn't say here is that the U.S. doesn't have that motivation either. Like I said, on the margins, if it can make like the regions as a whole more secure, and that advances U.S. interests, and you're allowed to make things a little bit better, but for the Palestinians, like Carter did, that's fine to do. But in terms of is there like a big urgency? Like, is the U.S. as urgent to like get come up with a two-state solution for Israel-Palestine as they would be to stop some nationalists from nationalizing U.S. oil corporations? No, like we've seen what happens when they try to do it. That's what Prime Minister Mossadegh tried to do in Iran in the 1950s, and immediately the U.S. comes in and overthrows their government for decades, and now that's why we have the Iran. And Obama mentions that, but it's like, this is like, if it was really within the U.S. interest, we have the power to do stuff. The reason that Israel is as strong as it is because we give them like $4.5 billion a year in military aid, more than any other country. And Obama acknowledged all this, but he also he wants to conflate like the actual he wants to diminish the actual U.S. interest, which is economic interest, hegemonic interest, and kind of just maintaining the global order and global supply chains and power, which he's puts throughout there, but he diminishes because he doesn't want to be viewed as like the head, like the head of the U.S. empire. He wants to be viewed as an idealist who just happens to be the head of the empire, and then he'll elevate other concerns which are tangential and small in reality, like coming to a two-state solution. This is like, we can do it, we can not do it, but like these concerns are the ones that you don't want to mess with. And Obama isn't able to acknowledge that in the case of the U.S. Okay, and so here comes Obama the idealist, just as right on cue. He says that given everything that was already on my plate, so he's like making an excuse already for why he wasn't able to do stuff. Look at how much stuff I have to do. When I became president, it would have been tempting to just do my best to manage the status quo. It would have been tempting to do that, but instead, look what he did. Look how great Israel-Palestine was. Compare Israel to Palestine in 2008, and then remember in 2016 what it looked like. Big difference. Like, what is he talking about? It's worse than, like, he didn't do anything. He maintained, but he, again, people don't follow this stuff that closely, so he can say that he tried really hard to change things. So maintain the status quo and quash any outbreaks of renewed violence between Israeli and Palestinian factions, and otherwise leave the whole mess alone. That's what I could have done. But taking into account the broader foreign policy concerns, okay, that's a revealing sentence. The broader concerns are what I just mentioned a second ago. I decided I couldn't go that route. Israel remained a key U.S. ally, again, what I just mentioned for the reasons that I mentioned it, and even with the threats reduced, it still endured terrorist attacks that jeopardized not only its citizens but thousands of Americans who lived or traveled there. Okay, so that's the justification for the population. It's like, I had to do this. Again, I did it for the hegemonic reasons of control and power that I just ran through a second ago, is what Obama actually did. He codes that language and then says that he did it to stop terrorism against U.S. citizens in Israel. He just mentioned a half paragraph ago that there is very little terrorism in Israel. There's lots of violence and terrorism in the West Bank and especially in Gaza, but he's not going to mention that. But then he has to couch that into like a nationalist concern for U.S. citizens. So there's hardly any terrorism in Israel, as he just mentioned, and there's thousands. Keep in mind there are hundreds of millions of Americans, thousands of Americans in Israel that have that very small chance. So it's like, what is he talking about? It's like maybe one American would die in like his whole administration from terrorism in Israel. Well, one life is too many. Oh yeah, play that. Play that like that. You might be able to make that argument if instead if during your administration many tens of thousands of lives in places like Gaza were lost because of your policies and you weren't able to say a mumbling word about it. In fact, when Obama was inaugurated, like I mentioned, every few years Israel has to go back into Gaza to kick it around to show the population to stay in line and then also demonstrate that it's a military force. And so in 2008, after Obama was elected, but before he was inaugurated, December 2008, January 2009, Israel did its second to biggest invasion of Gaza, which was called Operation Cast Lead, which I forget exactly the details, but on the order of 2,000 Palestinians were killed. Schools, hospitals, everything that you could imagine bombed under the pretext of stopping terrorism, because again, that's a pretext for everything, stopping terrorism. And that allowed Israel to, and Obama didn't say a thing about it the whole time, but do you know when it stopped? It stopped the day before or the day of his inauguration, because Obama didn't want this hovering over the head. And the reason that Israel went in during that time is because it was during the transition phase. So Obama was able to say, I can't comment on this. Like, we will leave this to the administration, and therefore didn't have any, was able to brush it off his shoulders without taking responsibility for it. But he had to stop it before his inauguration, because that would have been kind of like a little disaster. So Israel goes in, kicks it around, thousands of people die. They're dropping white phosphorus, which burns at like 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit on people. War crimes all over the place. Human rights organizations realized it. I think Amnesty International wrote a report called like 21 days or 31 days or however long it was of death and destruction in Gaza, which went through the record. There was a report called the Goldberg Report or the Goldstein Report, I forget, which was written by like an Israeli military official that was like impartial, that went and did that, and it was totally overwhelming, and that was a big public relations nightmare, and Israel eventually put enough pressure on him that he retracted it years later. But no, everybody, like, it's right there to see, and Obama had nothing to say about it at all. Now, when there's a possibility that one American citizen or like a handful might be at somewhat of a threat from terrorism, which is really people resisting an occupation that are slowly having their culture destroyed year after year illegally by U.S. weapons and support for Israel, then Obama will become the human rights activist that he tries to paint himself as universally, when in reality it's very selective and only and usually only brought up when he's able to further American militarism, but rebrand it with the veneer of human rights. And here Obama starts talking about AIPAC, which is like the biggest, most notable or most well-known right-wing branch of the Israeli lobby, which is the American Israeli Public Exchange Council, I think, which the Democrats cater to also. Like both parties cater to AIPAC all the time, but there's kind of been a fissure that's resulted, especially with Netanyahu coming to the U.S. during the second half of the Obama administration to criticize Obama's nuclear deal, and so there's kind of been a break with AIPAC. But Democrats will still go out of their way to support AIPAC, and like Hillary Clinton will give speech there that are the most hawkish things that you've ever imagined, and she'll write during her presidential run, like one of the things that she wants to do is like go out of the way to make sure that she's increasing relations with the Netanyahu government. So there's a little bit of a tension there, but really both parties cater to it. But Obama says here, those who criticize Israeli policy too loudly risked being tagged as anti-Israel and possibly anti-Semitic and confronted with a well-funded opponent in the next election. And that's absolutely true. Like defenders of Israel will equate criticism of a country occupying and killing people illegally against international law with criticism of Jews and being anti-Semitic. Like this is like the what is there to say about this other than this is identity politics run amok? Again, okay, I'm not going to go into that too much, but like the idea that you can't identity is paramount, and so because this group was oppressed historically, that any criticism of people within that group or a country in this case engaged in widespread human rights abuses is anti whatever it is, in the same way that criticism of Hillary Clinton was anti-woman, or criticisms of Barack Obama from the left were based in anti-black racism. This is a propaganda tool that's been used more and more over the last few years by people on the left. But this is like the crux of it, the idea that like criticizing Israel is anti-Semitic. Well, what can you say about that? Like, you're an anti-Semite. Like, how are you going to defend yourself? I'm not an anti-Semite. Yes, you are. That's exactly what an anti-Semite would say. Why are you bombing and destroying Gaza while engulfing the West Bank? Quiet anti-Semite. You're just saying that because you hate Jews. Well, the conversation ends right there, and it's a good weapon, and it's utilized by like the most repressive, powers and institutions within society to further their own interests. And Obama acknowledges it here in a half a sentence before continuing with his rendition of the events. Okay, so now we get to the part where Obama enters history and what he did for the peace process. And he says, the immediate question was how to coax Netanyahu and Abbas to the negotiating table. Netanyahu being the president of Israel, who Obama just spent a page heaping praise upon and giving his biography with subtle jabs at him, just like he does for every single person in power, whether it's George Bush or John McCain or Larry Summers or whoever it is. Everybody in power, Obama needs to give a long rendition of all their great characteristics, with a couple subtle jabs if they disagree with him politically on things, without anything fundamental to critique about them, because Obama's a man of history, so he plays a game and he pays deference to other important powers. And Abbas to the negotiating table. Abbas being the head of the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which is the Fatah party, the head of Fatah, which controls the PLO, to come up with answers. I relied on a talented group of diplomats, started with Hillary. I'm going to rely on Hillary to, run my peace process. I wonder if it's going to work. Do you know that Hillary Clinton, I don't think she's ever opposed a war. As in, like, the U.S. has been at war, like, she's been in public life since the 90s at least. We've been at war many, many times in the last 30 years. I can't think of a single time that Hillary Clinton opposed a war, and I can think of times where she's said hawkish things for wars that haven't even started yet. So a war, a military action, like she always, I can't think of a single time when she's opposed it. If she has, like, let me know. But every single war, like she was the one, as we're about to find out, that was pushing for the Libyan intervention. She was the one that was calling for regime change in Iraq, along with most of the other Democratic senators. She never criticized the drone program. She actually wanted Obama to be more hawkish in Syria and start a war in Syria back in 2013 when Obama crossed the red line. And that's like, again, Democrats don't attack each other, but Hillary Clinton came out of hiding to criticize Obama for not starting a war with Syria. This is Hillary Clinton, and she wants to start. She's going to be the head of the peace process. Hillary, who was well versed on the issues and already had relationships with many of the region's major players. Yeah, she knows all of the dictators and military officials within the region because that's the game that she plays. So Obama starts by saying, "We began by calling for a temporary freeze on Israel's construction of new settlements in the West Bank, a significant sticking point between the two parties, so that negotiations might proceed in earnest." And so Obama's like, "Okay, I'm the peacemaker here. I'm gonna try to get rid of this sticking point." For some reason, the Palestinians keep sticking this idea that, like, the construction of new settlements in the land, which is their land, that construction being illegal, and making the possibility of any permanent Palestinian state, which we're nominally in favor for, this two-state solution, impossible, because once the land is gone and the new people live there and there are no Palestinians left, there is going to be no Palestinian state. There are going to only be refugees and suffering and a larger Israel, which coincidentally is the reason that Israel continues to construct there. And also, the U.S. continues to support Israel's construction, even though, like, I think every administration, both Bush administrations, Obama administration, Clinton administrations, will say things like they're in opposition to creation of new settlements. And the whole time that they'll do that, they'll also continue to give Israel billions of dollars in aid, military aid, which they use for the continued construction and occupation of that land. So that's like a wink and a nod to Israel to be like, hey, we're going to need you to stop constructing settlements here. And they continue to give them billions and billions of dollars. That's called diplomacy under the U.S. That's called the peace process. And that tells you, like, with individuals, like, actions speak louder than words, people might have heard of. But with politicians and countries, they speak much, much louder than words in terms of, oh yeah, the U.S. is in support of human rights and a two-state solution. And we don't want you to construct any more settlements. Here's some more money to go construct settlements, and we're not going to do anything as you continue to accelerate the construction of settlements. So Obama in the U.S., not just Obama, but the U.S. over the years has wanted to look like they're supportive of the process, and because of global public opinion, they have to take the position of, we don't support new settlements, or Obama's mealy mouth position. We support a temporary freeze on construction of new settlements. The settlements themselves are illegal, like every settlement that's ever been made there since 1967 are illegal, but Obama's position is a temporary freeze on construction of new settlements for just this peace process. So, like, okay, this is where the balance of power has shifted so far that this is like the big ass that he's trying to get. Obama talks more about the settlements. He says developers, meanwhile, continue to build tidy subdivisions in and around the West Bank and East Jerusalem, the disputed, predominantly Arab section of the city that Palestinians hoped to one day make their capital. All this was done with the blessing of politicians who either shared the religious convictions of the settler movement, which is insane if you think, like, again, the settlers that are settling there are disproportionately extremely religious and orthodox and fundamentalist in terms of their reading of the Torah and the Old Testament. So they literally think that they're getting this book, this land, because it says so in a 4,000-year-old book written by Stone Age peasants, whatever, Yahweh granted David this land. And so therefore, the people that are currently living there and have been living there for thousands of years don't have a right to that anymore. Like, you can't make this stuff up. And these people are in alignment and to a large degree shaping U.S. policy in the modern era. Like, if you want to understand how insane this is, take the Old Testament, flip to a random page in the Old Testament, and read that page. And I think there's a better chance than not that there's going to be some animal sacrifices. There's likely to be some rape and pillaging, that Yahweh was justifying. There's going to be some very anti-scientific ideas about where germs come. There's going to be a lot of stuff in there. And these are people that literally believe all of that, and they're dictating U.S. policy today. And including, like, liberal, intelligent, intellectual, humanist presidents like Obama are kowtowing to these interests and not able to fundamentally take them on. That's the situation that we're in. He says, we knew that Netanyahu would probably... let me read it more. So for Palestinians, the explosion in settlements amounted to a slow-motion annexation of their land that stood as a symbol of the Palestinian Authority's impotence. So for Palestinians, the taking over of their land looks like a slow motion annexation. Obama can't just say this amounts to a slow motion annexation, which is exactly what it is. Like when they're taking over the land and making it impossible for a Palestinian state to be there, and it's totally obvious that they're trying to incorporate this into Israel. In fact, the settlements are being built there at a faster rate than inside the West Bank than they are in Israel proper. So Israel has lots of open land that it could build settlements, but it wants to take over that land so badly because of the religious convictions of the ridiculous settlers, as well as the political ambitions of the country to expand, that they're going to the West Bank to kick out the people that are already there more. And Obama can't even say that. So he has to say, for Palestinians, it looks like this. And Obama has to play, like, in the middle. He's like, okay, well, I'm the peacemaker. I'm the middle. This is what it looks like to them. This will look like to them. And, so I'm just trying to be the reasonable guy. He says, we knew that Netanyahu would probably resist the idea of a freeze, which is true, but also ridiculous that it's gone that far off the thing. The settlers have become a meaningful political force. Their movement well represented within Netanyahu's coalition government. True, and another indictment of where we're at with the Israel-Palestine conflict right now. Moreover, he would complain that the good faith gesture we'd been asking from the Palestinians in return, that Boss and the PLO, or the Palestinian Authority, take concrete steps to end incitements of violence inside the West Bank. Incitements of violence inside the West Bank. Here's the land that we're taking over, and for some reason, like, the people that are getting displaced are inciting violence, and so we're asking them to, take a effort to reduce the violence in the West Bank as we continue to expand there, or we partially freeze it, and then we stop the expansion. This is ridiculous. Like, if Obama was actually interested in trying to get peace, what he would do, like, the only reason Israel's able to do this is because the U.S. gives them money and political capital and diplomatic shielding for this type of thing. And Obama could end that overnight if he wanted to. It would be hard. I mean, he would have to take on his own domestic political forces and the AIPACs of the world and the Democratic Party and the Republican Party and the military-industrial complex and U.S. business interests, which views Israel kind of as, the business hub within the Middle East and creating stability and a good place to invest in. So he would have to take those things on. But if he was able to do it, or if he had the willingness to do it, then this problem could be immediately solved. You say, hey, stop building there. We're going to stop giving you money, and you need to come to the table. Then Israel wouldn't be able to do this. They're only able to do this because the U.S. is propping up. That's not on the agenda for Obama. And so instead he has to say all these nice things about Netanyahu and then try to paint a picture as if it's like anywhere close to equal at all. It's the overwhelming majority of the problem comes with Israel occupying the territory and expanding into the territory and the aid that the U.S. is giving to it. And that could be addressed if there was actual conviction or reason to do it. Obama doesn't have it, but he still wants to act like he tried to do something. So this is where you get paragraphs and passages like this from. Now Obama's talking about how he would talk with the Jewish organizations and the pro-Israeli organizations, and he said, periodically we'd invite the leaders of Jewish organizations or members of Congress to the White House for meetings with me and my team so that we could assure them of our ironclad commitment to Israel's security and the U.S.-Israel relationship. So again, Obama, the whole framework that Obama was trying to talk about before has to go into this. We have an ironclad, ironclad commitment to Israel's security. Again, what its security isn't defined. Israel, if it was actually interested in its security, would be much more secure. If it wasn't trying to hold a hostile population within its borders, insofar as that's a thing, illegally, thereby inflaming tensions of its neighbors and creating a universal condemnation of it on the global stage, while annexing this yes, that causes terrorism, and it also inflames tensions on the borders and leads to a lot of things. An actual two-state settlement would be good for peace, which is the reason that that dynamic is the reason that and it would be good for stability, and that increased stability is the reason that Carter was able to get the Camp David Accords through and get the Sinai returned, is because that dynamic's there also. Because once that land's returned, that's why Egypt is no longer at the throat of Israel. But Israel didn't like that because their goal was to expand and become bigger. And so that is if Israel's primary goal was security, then they would be pursuing a two-state solution. But Obama's, the way Obama couches it is he's assuming that, we need to maintain Israel's security, with the assumption that they can annex whatever they want to, and we need to continue supporting them for that, and that the resistant to that occupation, stopping any violence that might come towards the Israeli side, that's what we need to have as our top priority. And I'm going to assure the AIPAC people and all the special interests of that, and the U.S. Israel. And the U.S.-Israel relationship. So he's like, okay, the fundamental relationship we can't challenge, and then we can try to, get some peace in between. Okay, and so pretty much Netanyahu accepts the settlement freeze for 10 months in the West Bank, but doesn't accept it in East Jerusalem. He's like, okay, we've got to keep expanding in East Jerusalem, so I'm not going to do that. And so Obama's like, okay, this is a great concession that I had. In reality, it's like the concession he was asking for was already nothing at all, and like the bare minimum, as I already talked about. And Netanyahu gave him half of that for 10 months. And then Abbas criticized it correctly, and then Obama says, Abbas insisted that the absence of a total freeze, he would not join any talks. Other Arab leaders quickly echoed these sentiments, spurred in part by editorializing from Al Jazeera, the Qatari-controlled media outlet that had become dominant news source in the region, having built its popularity by fanning the flames of anger and resentment among Arabs with the same algorithmic precision that Fox News deployed so skillfully with conservative white voters in the state. So Obama is comparing Al Jazeera, which is true, it's funded by Qatar, and there is a tension there, and you don't want to listen to what they have to say about Qatar or certain issues. But he's in reality, like, their coverage of the Palestinian conflict is infinitely better than even the liberal outlets in the U.S., like the New York Times or NBC, because the history that I just went through, it's pretty black and white. But the institutions in the U.S. and the mainstream media and the corporate media have to kowtow or just continue to kowtow based on their institutional dynamics to the powerful institutions in the U.S., which are greatly tied to them in terms of advertising and the like. And so Obama criticizing Al Jazeera for this is totally ridiculous, and conflating them with Fox News. Again, people don't. It's silly. And so at the end of the Israel-Palestine discussion, Obama was able to broker a peace dinner with Abbas and Netanyahu, and everything went fine. People were polite, but Obama at the end of it is reflecting and realizing that maybe no lasting change is going to come from this, just because of the intransigence and the self-interest of the politicians that are partaking in it, Netanyahu and Abbas, and they don't have the higher level values that humanists like Obama that are not interested in power but only in bettering the world have. And so Obama sits there reflecting at the end of the dinner on his high horse. He has a horse and it's 30,000 feet high, and so he looks down at the world from 30,000 feet atop a high horse, thumbing his nose at the people that are making peace impossible. In doing so, like, it's a very big horse. It's bigger than the Trojan horse that took over Troy. And it is a Trojan horse, and it is a Trojan horse because this whole episode and others like it, which make up a large majority or a large portion of the book, are just a way of Obama to reflect blame from the actual situation and misdiagnose the situation and create false equivalencies which don't exist, like the idea that Netanyahu and Abbas are equally blocking the peace deal. Like, Abbas is corrupt, and he's corrupt in large part because the U.S. and Israel prop him up in order to kind of stifle the negotiations as well. But the idea that the PLO and the Palestinians are as culpable in the lack of a peace agreement as the Israelis, who are actively occupying and expanding their territory and have a vast disproportionate amount of casualties on their sides and are in universal condemnation on almost from the UN and from global public opinion. Obama's not able to say that, so he has to play both sides, and he has to end it with this type of crocodile tears. And he says, and I thought of okay, I'll just read the whole little bit here. He says, I imagine them shaking hands. He's imagining the end of the dinner. Imagining them shaking hands afterwards, like actors taking off their costumes and makeup backstage before returning to the world that they knew, a world in which Netanyahu could blame the absence of peace on Abbas's weakness while doing everything he could to keep him weak, and Abbas could publicly accuse Israel of war crimes. So he's accusing Israel of war crimes. He's like, Abbas is being ridiculous and accusing Israel of war crimes. Israel's been accused for war crimes by many high officials within the UN and by the entire world, or by anybody who watches the videos of them blowing up schools and dropping white phosphorus on children. But Abbas is going to be ridiculous like this, just like Netanyahu was. of war crimes while quietly negotiating business contracts with Israelis and Arab leaders. With the Israelis and Arab leaders could bemoan the injustices endured by Palestinians under occupation, while their own internal security forces ruthlessly fettered out dissenters and malcontents who might threaten their grip on power. Okay, again, Obama is obfuscating right here. Like, he's talking about maybe like the procedures within Hamas, which is not good for the Palestinians, but that's a separate issue that has nothing to do with the peace agreement, that has to do with more repression for the Palestinians itself. The peace agreement, which Obama's talking about, is blocked by Netanyahu, but he has to conflate it here, and in doing so, he obfuscates blame from himself, and he ends it. I thought of all the children, whether in Gaza or in Israeli settlements. So again, he's thinking of all the children. Well, if you're thinking of all the children, that, like I said, there are millions and millions of them in Gaza living in miserable poverty, and in Israeli settlements, I think one has died, from rocket attacks during after thousands were killed in the thing. So Obama says he thinks of all the children. Well, coincidentally, he mentions them as if they're in equal proportion, but the proportions are actually 1,000 to 1, almost literally those proportions, with the blame disproportionately on one side, which you're propping up and giving the weapons to. Or on the street corners of Cairo and Amman. He's thinking about all the children everywhere. Save the children. We would continue to grow up knowing mainly violence, coercion, fear, and nursing a hatred because deep down, none of the leaders, the other leaders, not him, I'd met with, believed anything else was possible. These other leaders just weren't able to do it. And me as a president, I was helpful. I was kind of like a helpless child also. I'm the president of the United States giving billions of dollars to them, but I'm kind of like a helpless child like you, but I want to save the children. I'm kind of like the catcher in the rye. I'm grown up and in power now, but I just want to save the children because deep down that's what I am. So I want to catch these children in Israel, in Gaza. They're equal amounts in both places, and I want to save all of you, but I can't because of the world, and it's just not fair. And I'm Holden Caulfield, and I'm Barack Obama, and I'm the president, and it's not fair. So now we reach a part of the book where Obama's talents as a orator and scholar and poet and storyteller are going to have to be put to the test to the extreme. He's been telling stories this whole book, but now the gulf between Obama the president and the things that he did versus the persona of Obama the humanitarian idealist, that gulf is going to be so wide that the web of stories and justifications that he has to construct in order to connect those two personas are very wide. So this is a part of the book where Obama starts talking about the Muslim world and specifically the Arab Spring. But before jumping into the details of all that, Obama the idealist gives his synopsis of the situation. And so he says, we bemoan the restrictions that were placed on women and girls, hindering their ability to go to school, work, or in some cases even drive a car. We noted the stalled growth and its disproportionate impact on the younger generations in Arabic-speaking nations. Most of all, Obama is worrying about the autocratic, repressive nature of nearly every Arab government. Not just the lack of true democracy, he's worrying about the lack of democracy, but also the fact that those who held power seemed entirely unaccountable to the people that they rule. So it seems. Even as conditions varied from country to country, most of these leaders maintained their grip through an old formula: restrictive political participation and expression, pervasive intimidation and surveillance at the hands of police or internal security forces, oftentimes subsidized by the U.S., dysfunctional judicial systems and insufficient due process protections, rigged elections, an entrenched military, heavily subsidized by the U.S. in most of these cases, heavy press censorship, and rampant corruption. Okay, yeah, that's accurate. Many of the regimes had been in place for decades, held together by nationalist appeals, okay, shared religious beliefs, okay, tribal bonds, okay, to a lesser extent, family ties, and webs of patronage. And one more thing. Billions and billions of dollars of U.S. aid and diplomatic support and cover. It's what countries, there are countries that are allies to the U.S., but they do bad things like this. So when they're criticized, it's phrased as, we worried about the autocratic, repressive nature, as we give them billions and billions of dollars. If you want to understand what happens in the international arena, what you do is you look at where the money goes, who's supporting who, diplomatic practices, UN vetoes, and things that actually substantively matter, who's buying weapons from who on the ground. And if you want to just make yourself feel good about your country, what you do is you read presidential biographies that say that we worried about these things. And so in the same way that Obama is concerned about the Palestinian problem, but wasn't able to do anything and kept giving billions and billions of dollars in that direction. The same goes for the other Arab nations also. It's like, okay, yeah, you're worried about these restrictions. He's worrying about the crucifixions in Saudi Arabia. If that was actually like a top priority, then there would be things that he could do about it. In the same way that regimes that are actually in opposition to the U.S., like Cuba, has been embargoed for like 50 years, more or less, or at least from the 60s up until like 2010 or 2014. And Iran, we don't like Iran. There's a lot of things going bad in Iran because they're unable to get imports. They don't get any aid from the U.S., and we make the life very difficult for them, to a lesser extent, Russia and other countries like that as well. That are actually in opposition, the U.S. does lots of stuff about. We don't spend tens of billions of dollars buying their oil as we subsidize their regimes, and sell them hundreds of billions of dollars of weapons, or $100 billion of weapons in the case of Saudi Arabia. But Obama is helpless to do anything about it. And he says, what to do with that knowledge? For there was a rub. For at least half a century, U.S. policy in the Middle East had focused narrowly on maintaining stability. And so Obama says that we need to maintain stability in the Middle East. That's what the U.S. has been working to do this whole time. And from a certain lens, that is what the U.S. has done. So as long as stability is defined as maintaining U.S. trade routes and supply chains and making sure that, regardless of what the people of the region want, that the wealth from the energy resources of the region are going to flow back to Western corporations and countries. We can sell our weapons to that region as much as possible, $100 billion to Saudi Arabia, as I mentioned, and that regardless of what the people want there, there's going to be U.S. bases all around the Middle East because that's just how it works. Insofar as that stability is what needs to be maintained, that's what the U.S. goal is to maintain stability. Now, if stability is defined as making sure that there's not wars breaking out there all the time, and it's an extremely volatile region, as is clearly the case for the Middle East, that is obviously not our goal. It's not that U.S. policymakers are stupid when they spend tens of billions of dollars undermining that as they prop up autocracies like in Saudi Arabia, which spends billions of dollars itself exporting the most fundamentalist, unstabilizing religious beliefs in the world all across the Middle East, which is Wahhabism, which they do with madrasas. So they're creating religious schools and exporting that ideology throughout the Middle East, a country which chops off people's heads for sorcery, among many other things, doesn't let women drive, and so on and so forth. This is the stabilizing force that the U.S. is propping up. And so Obama wants us to believe that maintaining stability is in the U.S. interest. It's a really unstable region. Like Pakistan has nuclear weapons. They're sitting right on the border with India, which also has nuclear weapons, and there's disputed territory, and that's constantly almost inflamed. Israel obviously has a bunch of nuclear weapons. They're inflaming tensions with the Arabs of the region as they continue to occupy the West Bank and Gaza and the Golan Heights and invade Lebanon every few years. That's not stabilizing. The U.S. supports that. There's 100 things which are not stabilizing. Invading Iraq, constantly bombing the Middle East, not super stabilizing, but Obama wants you to believe that that's the goal of U.S. policy. And he does get most people to believe it as they write, profound reviews of his books in the New York Times and Washington Post. So the U.S. goal is to maintain stability, prevent disruptions in our oil supplies. Okay, there's the actual rub. Yep, that's okay. That is one. And keeping adversarial powers versus Soviets and the Iranians from expanding their influence. Okay, and so keep the Iranians, which is one of the biggest countries in the Middle East, they can't have too much influence in that region. That's our region to have influence. We are thousands of miles away over an ocean, but the assumption, which we all need to hold, is that the world is ours to control, and so if the Iranians try to expand their influence, then that's not good. If the Saudis want to expand their influence, that's fine because the oil is flowing to them. But the Iranians, ever since the revolution, ever since they overthrew the government, which we imposed on them after we overthrew their government back in 1954, after they overthrew our Shah, we have to make sure that they're not trying to do too much to increase their power in our region of the world or disrupt the oil supplies. This is actually the real reason, but Obama puts those three together like they're coherent at all. The real one is maintaining oil supplies, and maintaining stability in the narrow sense of maintaining U.S. interests in the region. And Obama says, after 9/11, counterterrorism took center stage. In pursuing each of these goals, we'd made autocrats our allies. They were predictable, after all, yes they were, and committed to keeping a lid on things. They were committed to helping. They hosted our military bases and cooperated with us on counterterrorism efforts. And so the way Obama phrases this, first of all, it suggests that, these autocrats weren't our allies like this before 9/11, when in reality they were, and it was maintained throughout. Even though it was kind of a public relations disaster for the U.S. to try to justify how they're going to maintain or expand relations with Saudi Arabia to fight terrorism when 13 of the 19 hijackers were from Saudi Arabia. Osama bin Laden is from Saudi Arabia, the son of a really rich person from Saudi Arabia. The ideology that Saudi Arabia exports throughout the region, that type of extremist Sunni Wahhabist doctrine, which they spend billions of dollars building madrasas around the Middle East to expand, and is like the ideological pool from which Al-Qaeda and ISIS draw their support from. The same type of head-chopping ideology. That's what Obama wants you to think are our allies that were committed to keeping a lid on things. And it was kind of unfortunate for the Bush administration. It was difficult for them to justify why we had to go into Iraq when there were no hijackers from there and they had nothing to do with 9/11 or Al-Qaeda, but Saudi Arabia had everything to do. Well, that tells you what U.S. power is. And Obama's playing the same game here. He's like, this is what we had to do to fight terrorism. In reality, the reason that terrorism is so big is because every time there's an opportunity to choose between secular nationalism and extremist fundamentalism aligned with the United States, then they'll choose the latter. And then there's just different ways of justifying it. And so for constitutional scholar, Nobel Peace Prize winners, this is how you do it for Obama. But this is totally ridiculous. And then a helpful sentence, and he says, and of course, they did lots of business with U.S. companies. So this was just an afterthought for Obama. But he's going to put it in there so nobody can accuse him of omitting it. So, for Obama, it's like highest priority, counterterrorism, human rights, helping people, maintaining oil supplies, doing business with U.S. companies, letting our bases stay. But again, this is the idea. Like, this is the main reason. And then there's this also, which has something to do with it, but we're not going to go too much into that. And so then Obama introduces us to Samantha Powers with her obligatory, page-long mini biography. And he says here, this is quintessential Obama. So he says, Samantha was one of my closest friends in the White House. Much like Ben, she invoked my youthful idealism, the part of me still untouched by cynicism, cold calculation, or caution dressed up as wisdom. And so Obama, again, that's still at his core, so he makes sure to emphasize that. And I suspected it was precisely because she knew that side of me and understood what heartstrings to pull that at times she drove me nuts. I didn't actually see her much from day to day, and that was part of the problem. Whenever Samantha got time on my calendar, she felt obliged to remind me of everything wrong which I hadn't righted, which is Obama's, core concern. It's important to have these, humanitarian, kind of spiritual leaders within the White House to pull on Obama's heartstrings and remind him to do the right thing. In reality, Samantha Powers has made a career off of writing books about, what other countries have done badly. Like she wrote a book called A Problem from Hell, the genocide problem. So she'll talk about genocide. She'll talk about it in Kosovo. She'll talk about it in Rwanda. She'll anytime that it's doesn't really affect the U.S., she'll talk about genocide. I imagine she'll probably have talked about it in Cambodia and stuff, even though the U.S. actually propped up the Khmer Rouge before they didn't. But that's a separate story. But she has portrayed herself as just this idealist that just happens to be at the highest, crux of U.S. power atop the U.S. imperial machine. And it just so happens that the U.S. is never part of any of these problems, and it's actually the solution. The solution to these, humanitarian disasters is for more militarism and interventions by the U.S., as we're about to find out, as she crocodile tears her way into justifying the failed state, or the creation of the failed state of Libya, which Obama's about to overthrow. But she's really dishonest. And so if you pay enough attention to Obama's ocean of deceit and misrepresentation and mischaracterization, a few waves of truth will break through the tide. And so he says, many of the veterans, so he's talking about, despite all the obstacles, was committed to changing U.S. policy in the Middle East. But it was hard because many of the veteran diplomats and experts they talked to were predictably skeptical of the need for any changes to U.S. policy, arguing that as unsavory as many of our Arab allies might be, the status quo served America's core interests, something that wasn't guaranteed if more populist governments took their place. Period. So that's it. And then Obama says, despite that, over time, though, my team was able to arrive at a coherent set of principles to guide a shift in strategy. Under the emerging plan, U.S. officials across agencies would be expected to deliver a consistent and coordinated message on the need for reform. They would develop specific recommendations for liberalizing political and civic life in various countries and offer a range of new incentives to encourage their adaptation. So Obama's like, we have a new messaging about the need for reform. And in the meantime, here's hundreds of billions of dollars of weapons. Here's billions of dollars in aid, and, here, we'll keep buying your oil, and so we're going to keep doing everything. There's going to be no carrot, or there's going to be no sticks, and there's going to be a lot of carrots, but we're going to talk about how we need reforms, and we're going to have this diplomat, have this one person in this bureaucratic office, come up with an idea for how you should change things, and that's really going to do it. And so I did my best. And so Obama has totally accommodated himself to the veteran diplomats and experts that wanted to maintain America's core interests, which he talks about right here. All of the main policies that they want, they're going to continue. We're going to keep propping up these regimes, but we're going to change it without having any teeth attached to that change at all. But it's going to look good in my biography. And so now the demonstrations are about to start, and Obama starts talking about Egypt. And so he says, one of the tragedies of Mubarak's dictatorial regime or reign was that it had stunted the development of the institutions and traditions that might help Egypt effectively manage a transition to democracy, like strong political parties, an independent judiciary and media, impartial election monitors, broad-based civil associations, and an effective civil service and respect for minority rights. And so, this is one of the tragedies of the Mubarak regime. Mubarak is a tragic figure that has led Egypt down this. In reality, Egypt has been the second biggest recipient of U.S. aid for decades at this point. And so Obama paints it as a tragedy. We were explicitly propping him up. In fact, Egypt wasn't even a U.S. ally up until after the Camp David agreements, and Israel returned the Sinai, and in return for that, Egypt was incorporated into the new world, into the world order, into the U.S. orbit, and as a consequence, got billions and billions of dollars in aid to prop up a regime exactly like this. And now Obama's trying to get you to think that it was despite all of these things that the U.S. didn't want, restricted press, restrictions on democracy, all these different things that we begrudgingly gave him these billions of dollars, when in reality it was because of those things, and as a result of those things, Mubarak was able to tilt his political preferences towards the West, despite any disagreements from the population, that we were giving him those things. And then Obama, and so the demonstrations start, and his younger advisors, his idealists, the Samantha Powers, are just all for the being on the side of activists and the people and the idealists, which Obama really is at heart. But then also his older advisors kind of want to maintain stability in the region and maintain hegemony. And so Obama is torn. And so he says, I shared both the hopes of my younger advisors and the fears of our older ones. Our best bet for a positive. So again, Obama is on both sides of the issue again, as he always is, in this way, but maintains the credibility of He maintains the credibility of an activist while maintaining the policies of an imperialist. So now Obama, he has to make a decision about which side is he on. Is he on the side of the revolutionaries, or is he on the side of the dictator? And so he says, the media became more focused on my administration's reaction to the crisis, and more specifically, whose side we were on. What a weird question for them to ask. So far, we'd issued little more than generic public statements in an effort to buy ourselves time. So Obama was like, okay, we were trying to buy ourselves time. So then the next page, Mubarak gives throws a couple of bones to the protesters, but doesn't commit to getting rid of the repressive laws that he instituted, or stepping down, or stopping, being a dictator. And so, there's a split within the Obama administration. And he says, the more senior members saw Mubarak's concession as enough justification to stick with him, while younger staff members considered the move, much like Mubarak's sudden decision to appoint his chief of intelligence, Omar Suleiman as vice president as no more than a stalling tactic that would fail to placate the demonstrators. So at this point, essentially, there is a split within the Obama administration between like the old guard who want, Mubarak to stay in power and Obama not to say anything about it, and the new guard who want Mubarak to leave. And Obama is kind of trying to align himself with this because he's repressive and thereby allow for a peaceful transition to power that will make sure that U.S. interests are maintained and that, the more democratic forces in the country, or even like more sinister ones, which are still supported by the population, because again, extremism has expanded throughout the region in large part because the U.S. chooses to prop up dictators, which allows for the more violent and extremist factions within those societies to garner more support from that repression. Like the Muslim Brotherhood might be able to get to power, which is actually what happened later on in Egypt when President Mohamed Morsi was elected after he left. But Obama wants to align himself with the idealists, and so he's trying to. But really, what's happening is like when there's a thing like this, first what the U.S.'s game plan is they ignore it, so they hope that the protests go away, and then if they don't go away, what the U.S. will do is try to okay, it's time for you to go. We need to get a new person in, but they'll support the dictator as long as possible, and then when it's totally clear that they're going to be gone, that's when they might offer a mealy-mouthed declaration that we think that he should go after waiting forever, and then trying to get somebody in that will serve U.S. interests in precisely the same way. Like the human rights concerns are the very bottom of the barrel, but that's what they have to, give to the public for public consumption. And I'll just add that this is a playbook that the U.S. does every single time one of their autocratic allies is overthrown by a popular movement. First, they'll ignore it, then they'll, begrudgingly say that they're in support of it while still trying to undermine it or hoping that it doesn't happen. And then when it's clear that the person is gone, they'll say, oh yeah, no, we were in support of it. And then they'll try to shove somebody else back in there to take over the power vacuum that caters to U.S. interests in the same way. And then if the democratic forces actually win out and somebody not aligned with the U.S. comes in, that's when the real problem starts. And that's when they really try to undermine the regime that they were supporting the entire time when it was an autocrat. So they did it in Indonesia in 2000 with Suharto, supported him the whole time. Then the popular uprising comes, and then they're nominally in favor of it once he's finally thrown out, even though it's against U.S. interests. They did it in Chile with Pinochet once he was finally thrown out after torturing and killing thousands and thousands of people while helping U.S. interests. They're like, okay, yeah, it's time for you to go, I guess. Since you have to go because the population just kicked you out, I guess we're in support of that because we're in support of democracy. Doing it now with Mubarak. They did it with Iran. Actually, with Iran, they never even said they were in favor of the popular uprising. But that's what it was. Like the population was like, we don't want this dictator in here anymore. They're overthrown. And in that case, the U.S. is just like, sorry, like we need to continue supporting it. Haiti, they did it with Duvalier. Like when he's overthrown, prop up the dictator forever. He's finally overthrown and was like, okay, we're in support of democracy. Wink and a nod. Can we try to, keep the money flowing here? They did it in the 70s with Somoza when he was overthrown in Nicaragua. Support him as long as possible. Try to keep him in power. Then once it's clear that he's gone, try to support somebody else that will cater to U.S. interests. And in that case, the Sandinistas came in who were not in favor of U.S. interests and were a popular movement that were reformist, and that was when it was a real problem. And so that in that case, then you have to elevate every bad thing that the Sandinistas do and any human rights violation or any violence that they do, which there was some, but it was nothing compared to what Somoza did, and it was especially nothing compared to what the Contras did in Nicaragua, which were terrorists that the U.S. was funding. They were literally terrorists. The World Court ruled that the U.S. was funding terrorism, unlawful use of force, in a World Court decision, and that's exactly what it was. They were just getting funded by the U.S. We had the Iran-Contra program where we're selling the U.S. is selling weapons to Iran, a brutal regime, in order to get money to go back to the Contras to do terrorism, and this is U.S. policy. Like support the dictator, then begrudgingly acknowledge that he's gone while trying to maintain U.S. hegemony, and then reinsert that hegemony if there's any type of popular reforms which actually threaten U.S. interest. And so now it's happening in Egypt. He's like, okay, the protests are totally overwhelming. It's totally clear Mubarak is going to have to go. And so Obama's like, he's tried to save face long enough for the regime, and he's like, let's prepare a statement. I said to my team, we're calling on Mubarak to step down now. Oh, now we're calling on it after it's totally clear that he's gone and there's millions or hundreds of thousands of people in the street street, and the whole world knows that he's gone, and we've been trying to keep him in power for decades and decades, and even these last weeks. And now it's time for him to go because we want to be on the side of the good guys. Now let's work really hard to make sure that there's not a power vacuum that's filled by any nationalists that want to undermine the system, which we're the tippy top of and the beneficiaries of. And so even this late stage face-saving statement is too much for some people in the Obama administration, a bunch of hawks, including the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton. And so Obama says, Hillary was interviewed at a security conference in Munich and seemed to go out of her way to warn of the dangers in any rapid transition in Egypt. And so Obama's pretty mad about that. He gives her a call. He says, I can't have mixed messages out there, Hillary Clinton. And this is the person that you chose to be your top security official. Hillary has another quote, like right before the revolution. She says, I consider both Mr. and Mrs. Mubarak to be close personal friends. So she's close personal friends with Mr. and Mrs. Mubarak, the dictators of the region. This is like union representation, environmentalists, activists. These guys are kind of icky, but I like my Wall Street people and I like my dictators. And so I'm going to go out of my way to, even when it's totally clear they're going to be overthrown, to stand in the way of actual popular reforms and for the elitists and autocrats and authoritarians around the world, because I have very close ties to those, as I am Hillary Clinton. And so finally, Mubarak is forced to step down, and Obama gets to use that moment as a way to reinforce his credentials as an idealistic humanitarian on the side of the oppressed around the world against their autocratic, dictators, which Obama, wants no part of and actually helped overthrow. And so Obama says, in the White House, we watched the CNN broadcast footage of the crowd in Tahrir Square erupting in celebration. Many staffers were jubilant. Samantha sent me a message saying how proud she was to be a part of the administration. Walking down the colonnade on our way to my press statement to reporters, Ben couldn't wipe the smile off his face. It's pretty amazing, he said, being a part of history like that. Katie printed out a wire photo and left it on my desk. It showed a group of young protesters in Egypt Square hoisting a sign that read, "Yes, we can." So they're just like him. Yes, we can. Like, this is so dishonest. This is like, for Obama did everything he could to continue U.S. policy, which was propping up Mubarak, and the reason that Egypt was in that situation the entire time, or one of the principal reasons. Like I said, the second biggest recipient of U.S. aid. And do you know what happened right after he was overthrown? The first thing that happened was there was an election, and the Muslim Brotherhood candidate won, Mohammed Morsi, and then he was almost immediately, I think within like 2 years, overthrown by the military in a military coup, and then President Sisi, Fatwa al-Sisi, I think, was instated, and he's the current dictator there. And that entire time, and as soon as that happened, U.S. aid continued, U.S. support continued, and that continuation, it was a seamless transition from the Obama administration's support of Sisi to the Trump administration support, and Obama had nothing to say. And so it was like, and of course he had nothing to say because there was no popular revolution, and the U.S.'s core interests, were maintained. And so it was the best of both worlds. So Obama is going to take credit for overthrowing the government here, when in reality he did everything he could to maintain its power, and then has nothing to say about the arguably worse military dictatorship, which his administration went on to support for the second half of it. Obama is pretty good at taking both sides on every issue, but usually he breaks them up into different chapters, or at least different pages. But this time he got a little sloppy, and so this time he's taken both sides within the same paragraph. And so he's talking about the other countries that had uprisings in the Arab Spring, which of course he's an idealist. He wants to do something to help the people, but he was hamstrung, and he was hamstrung for two reasons. So he's talking about Syria and Bahrain. He says, my team and I spent hours wrestling with how the United States could influence events inside Syria and Bahrain. Our options were painfully limited. Again, Obama, he just doesn't have the power to change anything. Syria was a longtime adversary of the United States, historically allied with Russia and Iran, as well as the support of Hezbollah. And without the economic, military, or diplomatic leverage we'd had in Egypt, the official combinations of the Assad regime we made had no real effect, and Assad could count on Russia to veto any efforts, and blah, blah, blah. That's true. The U.S. doesn't have leverage against Syria, and so it's going to be tough to do anything. And so, in that sense, his hands are clean. And then he says, with Bahrain, we had the opposite problem. And so again, he can't do anything, but it's for a different reason. It's the opposite problem. The country was a longtime U.S. ally and hosted the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet. The relationship allowed us to privately pressure Hamad. So again, lots of private pressure. You're not hearing about it, but don't worry. Obama's been pressuring these dictators all the time. They're still there, and they've been there for decades, but we've been privately pressuring and his ministers to partially answer the protesters' demand and to rein in the police violence. Still, Bahrain's ruling establishment viewed the protesters as an Iranian-influenced enemies who had to be contained. In concert with the Saudis and Emiratis, the Bahrain regime was going to force us to make a choice, and all were aware that when push came to shove, we couldn't afford to risk our strategic position in the Middle East by severing relations with 3 Gulf countries. And so Obama's like, listen, I want to help change everything. But some countries aren't our allies, like Syria. So we don't have the diplomatic, military, economic leverage that we need to get them to make a choice. But then there's other countries that are our allies. And so these countries, we can't do anything because we have the diplomatic, military, and economic connections with them that we can't risk. And so we want to help change the world. We just can't do it with countries that aren't our allies, and we also can't do it with countries that are our allies. But other than that, we're happy to help. And so we'll whisper things on the phone to their dictators and be like, can you please stop killing this many people in the streets? It really looks kind of bad. Yeah, this is in the same paragraph. And again, no comment on it from mainstream people, but he's like, he puts it right there. We can't do anything for anything if it undermines U.S. interests. And so essentially we have no power in anything. Actually, you do have power, but you have to be willing to take on the U.S. interests, which are propping up these corporations and the military-industrial complex and the oil companies and the fundamental assumptions that this world order has been built upon. Obama isn't interested in that, and so he, by writing paragraphs like this, which portray him as a hopeless, tragic victim that wants to do his best but just can't in some type of Shakespearean play drama, then he can maintain his idealistic credentials while maintaining the world order and painting himself as somebody without the ability to do anything about it, when in reality he could. And so then Obama does what I think is a pretty gross pivot, and so he just has finished explaining why he can't do anything for all these autocratic human rights violators that are U.S. allies, because they're U.S. allies and they have to maintain that. And then he immediately pivots to a long passage about the great things that he did in Libya. And so Libya is a country that you are allowed to criticize because it's not in the U.S. orbit, and therefore Obama's about to overthrow the government and create a failed state and pin that as a human rights victory. And so this is going to be something. So he runs through all the crimes of Gaddafi because you're allowed to talk about those because he's not an ally. And again, this bolsters his Samantha Power credentials as a imperialist humanitarian. And then at the end of running down Gaddafi's atrocities, Obama has a throwaway sentence, which is actually really revealing. And so he says, Gaddafi had more recently tried to wrap himself in a cloak of respectability by ending his support for international terrorism and dismantling his nascent nuclear program, which led Western countries, including the United States, to resume diplomatic relations. And so the order of operations here, or if you're keeping track, is the U.S. convinces Gaddafi to get rid of his nuclear program, and then the U.S. comes in and bombs Libya and overthrows his government. And pretty soon, Gaddafi is going to be sodomized by a sword. And so when you wonder why regimes like North Korea and Iran are reluctant to get rid of their nuclear programs as the U.S. constantly threatens them with intervention and a regime change and war, this would be the model. And this is, like I said, this is what John Bolton said in order to undermine peace talks with the North Koreans, is that we want them to follow the Libyan model. That model being, get rid of your nukes, and then we'll overthrow you, and then maybe you'll be sodomized by a sword. This isn't super appealing to these other countries, and the U.S. overthrows governments all the time. This one, Iraq, many other governments, been overthrown by the U.S., and so that nuclear weapon is a deterrent, and U.S. analysts recognize it as a deterrent. It's hard to invade a country if they have nuclear weapons. The costs go up. If they don't have weapons, then we can just go in there and overthrow it really quickly. Well, what that does is create an incentive for other countries to get nuclear weapons if they want to be able to maintain their regime without being overthrown by the U.S. And so the U.S., in doing policies like this, is undermining global stability. And so Obama says that his top priority is nuclear non-proliferation. Well, this is one of the reasons that he wasn't able to do anything really effective on it, is that he maintained the world order, and in doing so made an incentive for any outside of the U.S. orbit regimes to get nuclear weapons in order to maintain their hegemony, which creates instability around the world. And so at this point, there's protests all around the Arab world, including in Libya, and Gaddafi is doing what the other dictators are doing, which is brutally repressing it, except for this is the one that Obama's picking out. And so Obama says Gaddafi was accusing the protesters of being fronts for Al-Qaeda, which is a common U.S. theme, and whenever they want to attack anybody, Iraq is a front for Al-Qaeda. These people are defending terrorists. You know that during the Obama administration, there was a bunch of, I think there were state laws passed that conflated animal rights activists that were like getting video footage of horrific brutality inside of slaughterhouses and then putting those online as terrorism. So there were terrorism. You can get charged as a terrorist for that. And so that is a common theme of governments, is conflating anything that would threaten their power as terrorism. They're eco-terrorists. Like if you turn a lever on a pipe and stop the flow of oil. Obama built a bunch of pipes around the world. You can be charged for eco-terrorism, and you go to prison for like decades for turning a lever on a pipe, because that's a lot of money flowing through there, and that's what really good. You can kill some poor people. You're probably not going to go to jail for it, but if you turn a lever on a pipe, or if you record some pigs being skinned alive or whatever it is, that's going to be a big problem. So anyways, Gaddafi does the same thing. He says that the protesters are terrorists, Al-Qaeda terrorists, and Gaddafi unleashed a campaign of terror, declaring everything will burn. By the beginning of March, the death count had risen to 1,000. So Obama is really concerned about these 1,000 people. I don't know where his sources are for that. I know that he's going to pick the numbers on the high end in order to justify his intervention, just like presidents always do, or countries always do whenever they want to invade a country. Is like, this is going to be terrible. There's going to be a mushroom cloud if we don't go in to stop overthrow Saddam Hussein. Like, there's going to be a mushroom cloud. He has anthrax in this little thing there. Like, there's going to be, who knows how many people. That would be millions of people are going to die. Got to go stop it. So Obama says 1,000. Maybe it was 1,000. I don't know the exact numbers, but I know that 1,000 is just half the amount of people that were killed in the West Bank during the month leading up to when Obama was inaugurated, and he didn't have a thing to say about it. And then that happened again in 2014 while Obama was the president, and he still didn't really do anything about it. And so Obama's 1,000-person concern is not very credible. He says right afterwards, but the Libyan leader was undeterred. Analysts forecast that once Gaddafi's forces reach they reach Benghazi, tens of thousands of lives could be lost. Again, I don't know which analysts they are. I know that Obama's going to pick the high numbers, but even if it was tens of thousands, the idea that tens of thousands, like during the second half of the Obama administration, I think 70,000 people were killed in Yemen through attacks by Saudi Arabia, which were funded by the U.S. using U.S. missiles, and also getting active U.S. intelligence during that time, not to mention that I think hundreds of thousands of others were at risk and are still at risk in some cases of famine, and this is still ongoing, and another continuation of the Obama administration seamlessly transitioning into the Trump administration. No comment there by any Democrats or Republicans, because when the protocols are the same and when the policies are the same and they benefit business and they benefit the military, there are no comments on this. And so he's not going to comment on the 70,000 people that he could actually stop by stopping giving weapons to this regime and stopping giving them active intelligence to commit what I won't call genocide, because that's kind of hyperbolic, but mass massacres in Yemen, not to mention the drone strikes and the many, many other military interventions. Like tens of thousands, the idea that tens of thousands of people is something that we need to be concerned about. It is, but like, you don't have the credibility to do that when I think over 1 million people have died in the Middle East as a result of the war on terror. Most of that was a war in Iraq, but also Afghanistan, the drone program, and bombings in Yemen and elsewhere that the U.S. is mostly in support of. And so now Obama's like, okay, 1,000 people has died, and maybe tens of thousands, which I think is inflated, could die unless we do something. And so in this way, he, just like Dick Cheney was trying to brand himself as a humanitarian to stop the mushroom cloud in Iraq, Obama's going to brand himself as a humanitarian by stopping the gigantic massacres that are going to happen in Libya. He can't do anything about the other countries, but here comes the humanitarianism. Then he says, it was around this time that a chorus grew around, first among human rights organizations and a handful of columnists, then members of Congress and much of the media, demanding that the United States take military action to stop Gaddafi. In many ways, I consider this a sign of moral progress. Okay, the moral progress is going to come when the military, demands intervention in other countries. If you actually go back to the start of the war in Iraq, they were doing the same thing. Like Judith Miller columns, like everybody was beating the drum for it. They fired Phil Donahue on MSNBC because he was the one anti-war voice, and leaked emails from NBC executives said that the reason they had to get rid of him is they didn't want anybody saying anti-war messages while the other networks were waving the flag. So this is the oldest trick in the book, and the idea that Obama is thinks that this is a new thing, that the media is cheering on war. Like Trump, like the media hates Trump, obviously. Trump drops the mother of all bombs in Afghanistan, and the NBC anchor Brian Williams literally says my heart is, he's quoting poets. He's like, my heart is filled with joy or whatever when I watch the awesome power and beauty of our exploding bombs. I just dropped a bomb bigger than any bomb other than a nuclear bomb on people, and it killed on the order of 100 people. And this is the most beautiful thing I've ever saw. So the idea that the media is not in support of war is totally ridiculous. Another thing to keep in mind is every single person that was killed by the mother of all bombs was classified as a terrorist. They drop it on the middle of nowhere, and it kills 100-something people. I guarantee you they don't know the names of all those people. And then they're all classified as a terrorist, and the media are like, oh wow, great, we just killed 200 terrorists a day or 100 terrorists. And that was the same policy for the Obama administration. Count every single military age male as a terrorist, and count pretty much people reflexively, unless we know they weren't terrorists, as terrorists. In that way, look, we're killing all of these terrorists. In reality, you're creating many, many more terrorists by killing people that aren't terrorists and then calling them terrorists and not commenting on it. And those people had families and communities and neighbors, and when they're blown up by the mother of all bombs without comment from the U.S., that causes terrorism in the same way that this overthrow of Gaddafi is about to cause a failed state, and now Libya is a terrorist harbor and one of the biggest humanitarian catastrophes in the world. Obama doesn't talk about that. But here's a Brian Williams clip.
We see these beautiful pictures at night from the decks of these two U.S. Navy vessels in the eastern Mediterranean. I am tempted to quote the great Leonard Cohen, I'm guided by the beauty of our weapons. And they are beautiful pictures of fearsome armaments.
Oh, God. Okay, here comes the end of the chapter cheese. Obama says, he's like, there's so much conflict. The Europeans don't really want to go in, but he knows he needs to save these people, and it's like, what do I do? He says, I also knew that unless we took the lead, the European plan would likely go nowhere. Gaddafi's troops would lay siege to Benghazi. At best, a protracted conflict would ensue, perhaps even a full-blown civil war. Well, we don't want a civil war in Libya, do we? There's a civil war in Libya. There's two different factions that are claiming to be the authority in Libya. At best, a protracted conflict, but full-blown civil war. At worst, tens of thousands or more would starve, tortured, or shot in the head. That would be the worst-case scenario. And at the moment, at least, I was perhaps the one person in the world who could keep that from happening. Obama is writing this as if he doesn't know what happened afterwards. That's exactly what happened, is the worst case scenario. In fact, the European, immediately afterwards, there was a gigantic refugee crisis because people were fleeing Libya because it had become a failed state. There was literally a slave trade going on in Libya right after this, because when you overthrow a regime without any plan afterwards, there's a giant power vacuum in there, and then, there's the slave trade, and then thousands and thousands of refugees, which caused a gigantic humanitarian crisis, which Obama isn't going to talk about here because he wants to be Rambo, the Nobel Peace Prize winning humanitarian. So now Obama's ordered the bombing of Libya and the overthrow of Gaddafi, and while this is happening, one U.S. plane malfunctions, and the pilot is ejected and isn't found for a little bit, and so Obama is really, really concerned, and he says, the entire time I waited for another tap on the shoulder. All I could think about was the young officer I had sent to war, who was now possibly injured or captured or worse. I felt like I might burst. And so Obama is freaking out that one person might be in trouble. One American might be in trouble. Because he just cares so much about people. It's like, imagine, this is one person that might be in trouble. It's an American. Of course, he's the undertones of Americanism and patriotism and America first, as other political constituencies might call it, are right there with a rebranded Democratic Peace Prize winning veneer. But it's like, let's take him at his word that he cares this much about one person. Like I said, thousands and thousands of people in Libya killed and displaced as a result of this. So imagine how he probably can't sleep a wink and just a result of that. He drone bombed many weddings, killing dozens of people at each one. Not people that had gone missing. They were literally drone bombed in weddings. Are you concerned about this at all? Palestine, there's many, many, many people to be concerned about. Obama's concerned about one person, and it just so happens to reinforce Americanism and get him a tap. It's like this is the person you're allowed to be concerned about. Because if you actually think or consider the people that your policies actually resulted in the deaths of, you wouldn't be able to justify those policies as a humanitarian, and it wouldn't look as good for you. So now Obama complains about some Republicans complaining about his choice to intervene in Libya, and I think he justifiably criticizes them for talking out of both sides of their mouth and not being sincere in their convictions, and rather just picking up random reasons to criticize Obama when they, on principle, they would support it if it was a Republican. But regardless, he says, they cast doubt on the legal basis for my decision, suggesting that I should have sought congressional authorization under the Wars Powers Act, a legitimate, long-standing question about presidential power, were it not coming from a party that had repeatedly given previous administrations carte blanche on foreign policy front, particularly when it came to waging a war. So he's like, okay, this is a legitimate question. I did it anyways. I just decided to start a war without going to Congress and overthrow a government. And so, yeah, it's a legitimate question. I did it anyways, but you guys are being hypocrites. Okay, yeah, no, that's all true. But guess what you just did? You just set up a precedent that if President Trump wants to assassinate a general in Iran, like he did at the start of the year, and almost start a war there, what are you going to say about it? Like that, oh yeah, Obama, like you shouldn't do it because you're Trump. That's what Obama is accusing the Republicans of, saying you shouldn't have done it because you're Obama. Well, that's what the only recourse that the Democrats or that the left would have once they accept the legal arguments or frameworks or precedent that Obama set with Libya. And what Obama did in Libya is actually overthrow a government. Trump only assassinated someone, which almost led to war, which would have been worse. But it's like the precedent is set up with Obama. Same with the whole entire intellectual architecture and legal basis and rationale for the drone programs. Like, oh yeah, no, that was Obama. So Trump is just able to expand it. They're like, okay, this guy's an authoritarian. They say he's controlled by Putin. They say all these different things. He's a maniac. He's a fascist. He's got, he's just able to drone people around the world because this Nobel Peace Prize winning president set up the architecture for him. And again, that has no comment because the consensus is there between both parties and between the establishment. Yeah, no, of course we can do this. And so the last chapter of the book, Obama needs to go out with a bang. And so he chooses to end it with what was the most universally applauded kind of action that his administration took in the first term, in terms of everybody gave him credit for it. Liberals gave him credit for it. Conservatives gave him credit for it. Hawks gave him credit for it. Doves gave him credit for it. Everybody loved it. I think his approval rating went up overnight by 8 points after the assassination of Osama bin Laden. And so Obama's going to spend about 20 pages here going through all the details of that raid and the great benefits which it bestowed upon the country. I won't go too in-depth in terms of my opinion of the raid itself, because I know that I'm in the minority in this situation, which is not the case for most of the criticisms that I made of Obama in this book. Most of those things, the population agrees with me in terms of whatever, getting money out of politics, or making sure that, bankers are prosecuted and that we don't bail out the banks with no strings attached, and instead help regular people, and that the healthcare reforms were totally inadequate and we need a single payer system, or that we shouldn't continue to pack the administration with Clintonites and Bush administration officials and continue the same policies. These are things that Obama went out of the way to, kind of kick his base in the face and to shun what was the view of the public in favor of special interests and a minority fringe view, which he then rebranded in order to maintain power himself. In this case, the people of America tend to disagree with me on this, and they agree with Obama. Personally, I don't believe that whenever there's a bad guy or somebody that's sufficiently terrible, that any laws and norms and human rights code and things that we've established over hundreds of years in America and in the West and in the world, which elevate individual liberties to a point where they can't just people can't just be arbitrarily assassinated, in this case, at the behest of the head of state, which is what they used to do in the Dark Ages and what they do in some countries still, which usually Americans, when that happens, will point to those countries and be like, this is why we're better than them, because we have human rights and we're advanced and we're civilized, and we're not just gonna succumb to nationalistic fervors whenever there's somebody we don't like and immediately suspend any due process for them. Well, in this case, the entire country was on board, and I understand why it was they were on board with it. It's an understandable kind of tribal instinct to go after after somebody that is a terrible person. But it's like, once that precedent is set, then you can, the repercussions of it, flow down to the rest of society. And it's one of the reasons that Obama was able to, and the Bush administration was able to expand the framework of the war on terror, which allowed for, extrajudiciary killings and the drone program to be expanded, and people thrown in Guantanamo Bay. Without due process, and extraordinary renditions where the Bush administration would literally just kidnap people off the streets, throw them in a plane, fly them over to Syria or Egypt or one of our tyrannical allies, and have them tortured at our request, because we have. And then the reason they were able to do it is because these people were terrorists. These people are really bad people. We don't need to, they don't need their rights. And it's like, you need to understand, if you have these rights, they need to be universal, or else if they can be suspended arbitrarily whenever somebody's a really bad guy, or the government declares it like that, then they're not really there, and then that will flow down to the rest of the country too. In fact, by any metric, Osama bin Laden didn't do as many bad things as the Nazis did, as the top Nazi war criminals. And one of the foundational pieces of kind of Western justice or American justice that people will point back to, usually positively, is the Nuremberg trials. And so after World War II, I believe the British didn't even want to try the Nazi war criminals. They just wanted to hang them. But we put rest, and actually I think Stalin pressed, and as well as the U.S., ironically enough, for those people to have trials. And they said, sorry, we're going to actually show where our values are. Even the worst criminals in history, we're going to give them an opportunity to defend themselves at trial. And if they're not guilty, then what's the harm? I mean, if they are guilty, what's the harm in putting them to a trial? And they did, and a few of them got acquitted, actually. I was just reading about this. But most of them were hanged afterwards. And those people killed on the order of 30 million people. Osama bin Laden on the order of 3,000 people. And it set a precedent that, look, this is what we're going to do. This is what distinguishes us, among many other things, from the Nazis, who would have just killed people arbitrarily that they disliked. And so in this case, we have a Nobel Peace-winning law scholar getting support from the entire country in the suspension of those rights in a way that I think is pretty kind of gross and nationalistic, and the worst type of patriotic nationalist fervor that kind of engulfed the nation right after. Obama talks about reminiscently about after he assassinated, how all of the different countries, or not all the other different countries, all the different baseball games that were going on then, and the stadiums, once they heard about it, you might remember, were chanting USA, USA. And it's okay, yeah, no, this isn't a good look, honestly. We know it's Osama bin Laden, but there's war criminals here in the U.S. If you want it, I know the characteristics are different, but by certain metrics, Dick Cheney is a worse person than Osama bin Laden in terms of the number of people that he actually killed. And so, would it be a good look if, let's say Iran was to assassinate, Dick Cheney, and then be chanting, Iran. Would that look it wouldn't look good, actually, and the Americans would understand it. And so personally, I didn't like the decision to assassinate bin Laden. And I understand that it might have been difficult to arrest him or to bring him to trial. But Obama, it's made clear in this chapter, he didn't even try. He just wanted to assassinate him. If it would have been the case where they tried to apprehend him and he immediately resisted or whatever, and they had to shoot him, that would have been more understandable. But it was pretty clear here that Obama was more interested in kind of spiking the political football and getting a win for America than he was in terms of actually upholding the law or any type of precedent for due process when he had an opportunity to. But that's kind of an aside. I won't go into too many details about the raid itself, but I will just mention a few things that stood out to me. One is that Obama goes into amazing detail about the raid. Who knew what the plans are, how many people, how many helicopters, what happens if this happens, how the decision-making process was made. Every detail about the raid written here right by Obama, and it was actually known very soon after the raid. And the reason it was known is because it was leaked to the press by the administration immediately after the raid. Tons of details about what was the name of the dog that was on one of the helicopters was leaked. All this information, which is classified information. It was probably some of the most highly classified information in the government, the secret about what we were doing in the raid of Osama bin Laden, and was immediately leaked to the press by the Obama administration without comment from the press and with a bunch of applause from the press itself as well as the population and both parties, and no pushback at all. In fact, I'm the first person to ever mention it in the world. Not literally, but like that. The reason that is that they're able to get away with leaking classified information is because the information is helpful for people in power, and there's no. And when people in power are in agreement of something, there's nobody to hold them accountable. And so those type of leaks are universally applauded. While leaks from Edward Snowden, Chelsea Manning, Bill Binney, whenever there's a leak from like within the administration that has information which is not doesn't make the government look good and doesn't make war look super, you know, fun and nationalistic and make everybody think that you know, the U.S. and the military is the best thing, like the Snowden NSA revelations, or like, you know, the video that Chelsea Manning leaked of like a Black Hawk helicopter in Iraq shooting Reuters journalists and civilians just indiscriminately. That information is kind of a thorn in the side of the government. That's the stuff that we need to keep classified. And when there are leaks, the leakers are going to be prosecuted to the full extent of the law and tried to be, you know, thrown in solitary confinement for the rest of their life, as in the case of what the U.S. is trying to do to Julian Assange right now, with support from, well, with obviously the Trump administration doing it, as well as the Biden administration, you know, in favor of it also, and MSNBC and Fox both in favor of it, because those are the leaks that are not helpful for the government. Interesting thing is that Obama, before the raid, is kind of like going over all his different options, and one of the ones he was considering was just blowing up the entire compound, but he decided against it for a few different reasons, and the main one is that kind of his humanitarian side, like, shown through here. And he says that I was not going to authorize the killing of 30 or more people when we weren't even certain it was bin Laden in the compound. And so he's like, sorry, like, we can't kill innocent people without being sure who the target is. I mean, as I mentioned, Obama's like done drone strikes which killed dozens of people, or on the order of 30 people, numerous times throughout his administration, where the people that they were targeting were much below Osama bin Laden. And so this doesn't ring super true to me when he's blown up weddings numerous times without comment, and still didn't comment on it at all in the book. But in this case is like concerned about killing extra people. In this case, if he would have, what I think is that his much larger concern, he kind of mentions this, is that if bin Laden hadn't been there, then it would have looked really bad, because it would have been like the press would have actually paid attention, because it was around Osama bin Laden as the central figure, rather than just unknown people in Yemen and Pakistan, that you can kill all of them you want and nobody will talk about it. And so that would have hurt his presidency, along with killing those 30 people, which I'm sure he didn't want to do, but he does all the time. And so there are gives and takes that you have to make. But the political calculus here would have said it would have been a bad idea. Plus, as he mentions, you couldn't have identified the body in that instance. And so Obama decides not to do that. And so the last character that Obama introduces to us in the book is William Mcgraven, or General William Mcgraven, who is the head of JSOC, which is the Joint Special Operations Command, which is kind of the organization that oversees SEAL Team 6 and all these special ops missions, and he oversaw the raid on bin Laden. And so Obama needs to he needs to say lots of nice things about him here. And so he says in one sentence, in his mid-50s, with a friendly open face, a deadpan sense of humor, and a plain-spoken, can-do demeanor, he reminded me of a sandy-haired Tom Hanks, if Tom Hanks had been a career Navy SEAL. And so that's William Mcgraven. Why it stands out to me is because there was a book by Jeremy Scahill and a documentary also, I think it might be on Netflix, or it used to be, called Dirty Wars, where Scahill actually goes to all these countries where we're drone bombing people and raiding their houses in the middle of the night and killing a bunch of civilians, and talks to the people there. And one of the stories that he talks about is a JSOC mission. I think it was maybe SEAL Team 6 mission, although I don't remember, that went awry, where pretty much the U.S. commandos shot a bunch of civilians that were the wrong people, and then after they realized they were the wrong people, they tried to cover it up, so they dug the bullets out of the dead bodies of those people and try to act like it didn't happen. Eventually it became exposed, and it looked really bad for the U.S. after they tried to cover it up. And so then William Mcgraven has to come back and comes back to this little village in, I want to say, Pakistan, in the middle of nowhere, and with a goat, and sacrifices a goat to these people to say, sorry that the U.S. did that, because it was I don't know, in their tribal society, that was one of the symbols of forgiveness, was sacrificing a goat. And so that's what William Mcgraven did. And that's what I first heard about it. You're not going to hear about that from Obama, though. For Obama, he's sandy-haired Tom Hanks as a Navy SEAL, which is, part of the story. But it's just like the negative parts of any of the people that he's trying to portray as heroes, which is his administration, and he wants to tie his legacy to. You're never going to hear about that from Obama or from any of the mainstream that talks about these people as, the best people in America. And so that is the end of the book. We got through it. It took longer than I thought it would. Like, the book was longer than it probably had to be, mostly because of hot air surrounding just patriotic language and aspirational nothingness that Obama loves filtering into every chapter, as well as just mini biographies about the details of every single powerful person which he interacted with, life and their high school basketball team and what they did in college and this and that, which is not relevant information. But when you're trying to narrativize your own life as a person of history, you have to pay deference to the other people, which are also powerful within that class. But the book itself, I won't go into any more detail on, but I think it's suffice it to say it's extremely dishonest, it's extremely misleading, and it's extremely self-serving. And it was written with a type of kind of passive-aggressive narcissism, which was feigning modesty, but really just, bolstering his own account of his own life and his own ideals the entire time, while justifying the lack of actual progress that was made, if not misrepresenting it. And so that's what I think about it, if you didn't see the last 8 hours. If you made it this far, you might as well subscribe to the channel, because this took 8 hours. Yeah, I appreciate you hanging in here with me.